My guest worked electronic warfare and signals intelligence for NATO, then protected Meta's data centers. Now he says your company has a shadow AI problem, and most of you don't even know it. I'm Peter Dam. This is Tech Uncapped with Michael Blicher from Velatir. Hello, Michael, and welcome to Tech Uncapped. I'm thrilled to have you on today, where we're going to talk a bit about you, your origin story, but also what you're working on right now, which is Velatir.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, really been looking forward for this episode. I've tried to catch up on the previous episodes, and It's going to be a blast, I'm sure.
Which one did you like the best?
Which one I like the best? Oh, I've got. I'll send it afterwards. I'm not one for highlighting anyone here. I'll send it afterwards.
That's fair. Yeah. Okay. All right, but let's jump right into it, Michael. Let's start by your origin story, who you are, and what led you to founding Velatir.
Yeah. So you of course know this, but and we briefly talked about this. But I grew up in Odense with my twin brother, who is also a co-founder of Velatir as well, and I think we've long been chasing something, at least. Like, we've always been competing in different realms and different arenas. We kind of separated ways professionally when we moved from home at an early age. Like, we both started in the military. I went to the officers academy and went on to become an intelligence officer in the Danish army for about 10 years, and he quit and became a lawyer instead. And I was out doing everything I imagined as a boy, helicopters jumping out of planes, deployment to Iraq and the like. And while he was studying hard in Copenhagen and suit and tie career there. But we've always been very close, from a very early stage, and we've always known we wanted to do something together. We just didn't know what, and we didn't know where our careers might lead us. And I think I've always been the part where I've been very good at grabbing opportunities as they pass by and recognizing opportunities, and this where we're at right now was such an opportunity. Because after I've spent 10 years in the military, and at some stage, living that, at some stage you need to settle down. I think that's what I talked with my wife about. You need to find yourself a real job, was what I was told, and that was when I joined Meta, and I've been working for Meta for 6 years at that stage. Then before jumping ship again, and then starting Velatir.
Mm-hmm. So if I can just jump in there a bit. So when you worked in the Danish defense, you were working closely with electronic warfare, right? Are you able to explain a bit about what you did there, how that was? I assume there's stuff you can't tell, but whatever you're allowed to tell, I would love to hear about.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I led a platoon within electronic warfare, and also went on to become like a subject matter expert on electronic surveillance. And I think it's something quite abstract, because it's something we all know and see and feel, but it's also very complex, electronic warfare and electronic surveillance. So I think in short, it's like it's surveillance, attack, defense on electromagnetic waves. So everything happening wirelessly, in a sense, is what that in captures, right? And of course, the mission in the defense is to either find the bad guy or protect your own forces, from us being caught or found, or impacted by other electronic warfare means. And that was very much it. So it was I think I went into the realm of intelligence with all the jokes and ideas of doing PowerPoints and presentations, and then all of a sudden it was a lot of ones and zeros and very technical. And I didn't, I never wanted to be technical. Like, I wanted to drive a tank, or fly a jet. But when I very quickly, when I landed in electronic warfare, I found it extremely fascinating. Like, the amount of information and data and insights you can pull out of something that's there, here, and everywhere in terms of electromagnetic waves was just extremely interesting. And then working with a lot of with people and working, in that intersection with very complex technology, and how do we interpret that so someone can make a decision that impacts, someone profoundly. Sometimes, it'd be life or death, or it would be, a tactical maneuver or whatever not. And I thought that was extremely, it's foundational for who I am today, because I landed as a platoon leader. I must have been like 21, and I was put in charge of 30 people ranging from 18 to 35, basically. That's, that had way more knowledge about all the technicalities and way more experience than I did. So it matured me a lot.
Yeah, that's a great way to be, just thrown out in deep water, figuring out how to. You can't be the best on everything, right? But that's not the point of being a leader. You have to make sure you get the best out of everyone.
Exactly, and I think that's followed me throughout my career, is that it's there's always been something extra to prove, because I've been the youngest one in the room, but the way that I've succeeded, at least, is just working extremely hard, and then trying to be a good leader. And I haven't always succeeded. I'm not trying to I know that there's always examples where when you want to go back with the knowledge now and change decisions you made. But I think it's a matter of being authentic. It's a matter of trusting the people that you have on your team, and then ensuring that that you have fun. I think that's a very important element as well. Like we spend a lot of time at work, be it in the military, be it at Meta, or now with Velatir. So I want to make sure that the team that we have around us is someone that generally enjoys working together, and we have a shared sense of a mission as well. I think that's something that followed me as well. We're not just here, spending time or looking at the clock. We're here to actually achieve something, and build something that's meaningful, right?
A bit closer. All right. That was just a short instruction from the producer. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, so what do you say is the hardest part about leadership?
I think the hardest part is the uncertainty and the authenticity and all the dictums out there of how to be a good leader. When in truth, I think a good leader is, in my view, and there's a million on it right now. I'm just contributing to the complexity and the confusion. But I think a good leader is an authentic leader. A good leader is a leader that's not overly proud, that can recognize when they make a mistake. A good leader is someone that can make quick decisions based on very limited input, and also is quick to revise if a new situation pops up. And I think a good leader is someone that sets a great example. That's not necessarily the best, but when they make a decision, they stand by it, and they take ownership and responsibility, and they shield their team so they can do their best work. Pass credit, but assume responsibility. I think that's very important. And then over time, if you're authentic and you're generally try and be a good human being, then I also think that you'll be a good leader. So and I think the worst leadership experience I've had with leaders is when they run into or when they have a hard time making their minds up, committing to a decision, taking responsibility.
You say be a good human. I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole of leadership, because we have a lot of other points to cover, but just very hot take on brilliant assholes. So you have Elon Musk and you have Steve Jobs, as you probably wouldn't rate them as what you said, they're fantastic human beings, but they really get results done, right? But they're also known to be very hard to work with.
Yeah. And I think I don't think that there's necessarily a contrast between being hugely successful and and you don't need to be a great leader to be hugely successful, and you can be extremely inspiring and capable and manage a team and make them perform. But the question, but for the far majority of people, that's not reality. If you strive to be a Steve Jobs, you better get you better have the skill set of a Steve Jobs to pull that off, right? And that's that's one in a billion.
Yes.
And so I think that's even, for the
That's
far
also what I
majority of
always come
leadership.
back to, right? It's very few people that can be a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk. So you cannot afford to take the position of being an asshole. Is kind of where, unless you are that brilliant that people will put up with it. But yeah,
Exactly.
otherwise it's just people won't work with their assholes over time.
And I think, it's always a trade-off. Like, people and humans are extremely complex, right? So, would you settle to work with a bad leader? Yes, if the mission was so important, or the benefits, or the logistics. Like, there's a lot of arguments in there. But why would you introduce friction on leadership when all it takes is for you to be authentic? And you don't need to wear a turtleneck and scream at people to get results. More often than not, that's a pretty bad way to get results, right?
Yeah. All right, let's move on from the military experience and the leadership and onto your next couple of years that you did at Meta. Tell us a bit about how you ended up there, going from the military then to being in charge of the security of data centers at Meta. That's a huge responsibility, basically taking care of the security of a big part of the internet.
Yeah, and I think, like, and to clarify that, like, my responsibility was primarily to the hyperscaler in Denmark, right? But it was I think that, the one thing that stands out was that the transition was a massive cultural shock. Going from, and even within the intelligence community where I used to work, like, it wasn't that the hierarchy wasn't that firm, because you would advise on a strategic level but be junior in position because of the special knowledge you had. Well, then I joined Meta, and I think the biggest thing, other than all of the perks and being a part of a company where you had a vending machine, you go out, bet your badge on, and you could get a set of AirPods basically, handed to you, which was like, where I don't need to sign 15 forms to get this piece of equipment, and I can get it today. That was incredible. But the point of the biggest thing, the biggest shock was when we actually agreed on something at Meta. When we left a room or a meeting in the beginning, and I thought, okay, we just agreed to do this. From that meeting to actual execution and it happening, the process was only just beginning. Whereas in the military, when you looked each other in the eye and said, we're going to do this, then everybody, did that, because that was the culture, and that was what you needed to kind of trust. So transitioning from a military mindset where the leadership task, right, and even leading without formal authority, was very much one of supporting, removing roadblocks, ensuring that that alignment and focus, was top of mind throughout the process, and not only at the beginning and at the end. I think that was a big push. And then there was the whole, like, I joined at the top of DEY, right? So we did, pronouns and introductions to begin with. I'd never done that in the military. And to begin with, I thought that was, that's kind of odd, especially in a setting or in a context that was Danish, because, that's just not normal in a normal Danish workplace. But it actually created an incredibly like warm and welcoming place to work, and I think that was also, it was a very international place to work. Even if the office was or the data center was located in Odense, like, it was video calls every day, late nights with San Francisco, early mornings with Singapore. I just colleagues from all over the world traveling in, working there, and I learned. I think that was where it finally kind of dawned on me that, like, the importance of authenticity, and again, and being approachable, or being a good human being. I think, one of the things, as I used to say, is like, my intro to Meta was, I picked the desk that was closest to the entrance, because then when everybody came in the morning, I could stand up and say, I stood up on my desk and I could say good morning to everybody coming in. And it was just a great start of the day, and it was a great kind of just to connect with them, because then if they had a problem, I had a problem, then it was easier to approach and get things solved.
It's a good take. I've done the opposite, but that's because I'm sitting in a co-working space, and so it's not the people I'm working with. So I find the far end of the corner to hide away and.
And it depends on your role. Like, if you need to do a lot of deep work and stuff, then of course I wouldn't stand there at the door in the morning. But it was just, more often than not, work and true alignment happens in between those decisions, right? And at the coffee machine or when you pass a desk, and I just enjoyed that. I think I worked with some of the best people I've ever worked with. In an environment where we didn't need to kind of think of all the things outside that environment. Like, there was the practicalities, finance, all the stuff. Well, it wasn't that big a deal at the point when I started. I used to compare it to, like, the best professional experience I've had was during my deployment in Iraq, because everything you trained for, you now went down there and you did it 24/7, right? It was intense. You could really you got to actually try it out. And it was kind of the same feeling I met, and especially in the beginning, like just 8 to 5 or whatever, and then everything in between, because if you wanted to have an impact, you really had the opportunity to impact. Yeah.
Let's jump on to another topic, and that's shadow AI. Could you explain briefly for the audience what shadow AI is?
I think most people have an inherent kind of understanding what does shadow AI mean, because it's like a derived term from shadow IT, which used to be extremely big, and nobody talks about it anymore, right? So shadow AI really is all of the AI that you or your employees are using, but not openly talking about or even having visibility on, right? And it's one of the things that that's come as the biggest surprise, perhaps, with the company we founded now, is that that there's several different arguments out there when we meet customers. We all everybody has come to a point now with the distribution and use of AI that everybody recognizes that we all use AI. Like, you never meet the argument anymore saying we don't use AI here, because everybody knows that that's what's happening. And I think what surprises a lot of people is to which extent AI is being used. So we have customers saying, like, we imagine you use 3 or 4 different AIs. Like, we know of ChatGPT and maybe Claude and some others, their Copilot. And then we map out and we identify like 97, right?
You say everybody, though. If I just do a bit push back a bit on that, because like there are stats that say that AI literacy is still like very, very low. That's very few people that are actually using it. But maybe you mean particularly people that work in tech companies, in IT companies, or would you do a wider definition than that?
Yeah, I think, like, of course, when I say everybody, I realize that we live in a very, very fortunate place on Earth as well, and are very privileged in that sense. So I agree with you that there might be areas somewhere,
if
right,
you don't have access to internet or a computer, then it's like.
But really, if you've got, and I think this is where the problem gets complex, because when you look at studies like that and how they define usage, it's also often very specific to certain applications. But the truth is, the moment you go into your browser, you use AI. Like, the moment you go on Google, you use AI. So we've come to a place now in time where I think AI is moving so fast that either you have an AI service or you have a service with AI in it. And the traditional kind of boundary between, I'm using ChatGPT or building agents in N8N or Zapier has kind of dissolved or disappeared in a way where, and that also changes the narrative and the discussions, because you can no longer, it becomes harder to control.
That's a good point, because like there's, of course, when you go into Google, you can kind of see that there is this AI text popping up that says, give me this quick explanation of something, right? And you just see it forming in front of you. And that's, of course, something that I don't necessarily think about on my everyday, but that is AI. But then there's also all of the things that isn't on the front end that is working underneath that you won't see. And we can have AI agents replacing APIs or working with APIs in a much more efficient way. So, there probably will not be any type of software product that you can engage with that doesn't have AI working on it on some level. And I think where I was thinking about it, I was just back to how do I use it consciously myself, because this is like the seamless unconscious part where it just happens to you in a way.
Exactly. And I think, and just having this discussion, right, opens up a realization that, AI exposure and distribution is way, bigger than what we've ever imagined. Because if you go out in a traditional form and try and map it, and you ask employees, are you using AI? Then all of the things that holding them back from declaring all the things they know, because they might be afraid of them being taken away from them. Hey, I use ChatGPT, okay. Then if my employee knows that, then they're gonna block it. The other part being that they don't realize, they don't consciously or remember, because it's become such a natural part of how we do work and how we operate as humans in such an extremely short period of time, which is also quite unique to this technology, right? And it'll only it'll only grow exponentially, and it'll only pervade more of what we do over the coming time, which creates a lot of dilemmas and creates a lot of false dictums, and weird decisions, and I think that's what we meet on a daily basis when we discuss it with our customers and potential customers. Is like, we've come to a realization now, or a lot of businesses come to a realization now, that their employees are indeed using AI. The naivety of saying, well, we told them not to, so they're probably not using it, has gone away from majority of businesses we speak to. And now it very much becomes a matter of, like, okay, if we actually look under the covers and see all of the tools that they're using, then we also have to do something about it, right? So that's an argument I've heard more and more as well.
I think for the audience, we just segued into what Velatir actually does. So that is basically, Shadow AI was the reason behind why you wanted to start Velatir. If you just do 3 steps back, you can maybe just start doing the intro of Velatir there, and then we jump back into this.
And I think the reason why to begin with was that we wanted to build something that truly mattered, like that, and we wanted to create a product, or service that, created value in this world of immense complexity, be it AI and technology at the speed of adoption. And I think we identified that a huge problem was lack of transparency. How do you harness that magic in a box that is AI in a way if you don't recognize it when you see it? And then we thought, and we iterated, like any software team and startup, we iterated like 1 million times on the product. It was way too technical to begin with. We built safe, and guardrails and the like for agents running autonomously. I was like, and that was last year. There was no agents running autonomously anywhere, so we created a product from that wasn't commercially sound. And then we thought, okay, but what's the problem right now that we can fix fairly easy based on the infrastructure we built? And that was one where people or businesses just don't know what AI they're using, because there's a disconnect between the people, the decision makers often, and the actual users. And AI has become increasingly decentralized in a form that you can offer your employees ChatGPT access or Copilot access, but marketing wants to use Clay or Apollo, sales want to use another application, the legal wants to use another application, and you don't know about that application as an IT department, because you wouldn't. It's not within your realm of expertise, because it's become so second nature. So how do we first of all identify all of these applications when there's new tools coming up every half an hour somewhere on the internet? And how do we classify them in terms of risk? And how do we enable businesses to use all of these applications instead of the narrative of we use one suite of products in our company? Well, when we don't believe in that being a sound approach from a business risk perspective in the future. So Shadow AI is kind of a wedge in where we show businesses all of the AI that they're already using, but our main product is very much like a horizontal integration. We call it enablement. Like, we want to ensure that all of the objections you have as a business to adopt AI very quickly and responsibly, that we can help you from a technical perspective to remove that, to reduce your to create agility in your company so you can adopt software quicker, because we take some of the risk from a technical perspective. And I think that's what we've been successful in building, because and I had this discussion at Mashup as well with at a roundtable where technology really moves in these S curves, and I think we are right now in an S curve where we're talking foundational models the winners of each S-curve is, of course, the technology providers, right? OpenAI, Anthropic, and the like. That'll commoditize over time, where it'll become a matter of price over capability. And the other winners of an S-curve are the businesses that succeed in implementing, adopting, and harnessing the newest and best technology. And with the steepness and the velocity of new technology coming in, and the exponential growth in capabilities, a lag in adoption just translates into an immense business risk. So you can't wait. You can't be a laggard anymore. You can't sit on the back end of an adoption curve. And businesses recognize this. Like, they need to lean into it, and they need something, which is what we're building, of course, to de-risk, because being at the front end of an adoption curve brings about a lot of risks. And because we just, the frameworks aren't there, we aren't mature enough as human beings to even understand the potential blast radius of AI. You've probably seen it yourself, Peter, on LinkedIn. Like, there's these how-to guides to set up OpenClaw agents on your managed devices, which is, I think it's incredible what you can do with an agent, but I wouldn't want to create a 10-step guide for everybody to set it up, because it's a huge vulnerability potentially, right?
There's for certain, specifically with OpenClaw, a lot of issues. I find it's a great innovation, but it also comes with a lot of headaches. But so, just trying to say it in short, so Velatir essentially enables companies to not work with the handbrake on, by, you can kind of surf through tools you can work. You may become conscious about what is actually being used in the organization, because it's surfaced, even the things that were used unconsciously or is used,
all of the missed opportunities.
Don't want to tell about it, or these type of things. And so that's a good way to steer safely while not having the handbrake up.
Exactly.
And
And what if your best employees or best department was actually augmented because they used the best tools? You just don't know about it. Like, how do you extrapolate that, or how do you build on that and expand that to the rest of your business? Well, we'll show you all of the missed opportunities you have right now, so you can capitalize on that, right? And then I believe another analogy that we often present is like, what is it that makes you sit in your car and drive 130 kilometers on the highway? As a human being, that's just not a natural thing, and you don't understand all the inner workings of the car. But I'll wager that, like, if you didn't have a steering wheel or an airbag or brakes, right, you probably wouldn't speed at 130 kilometers if you weren't certain that when you hit the brake that it would actually stop, or when you steered on the wheel that you would actually, be able to evade. And I think, that's very much everything we're building. Like, AI right now is the motor, the engine, kind of fueling a technological shift and, more productivity and all the likes. And we're building everything around that to ensure that we can control it. And therefore we dare to kind of step on the speeder, right?
Yeah. A bit related to what you're also doing is, of course, the whole conversation about data sovereignty. What's your take about the current debate, specifically from a European angle?
Yeah, it's something that I hold very close to heart. I think we built our product to begin with. We didn't have data sovereignty when we did POCs and built the product and trying to iterate it on it. Data sovereignty wasn't top of mind. But very quickly we found out that if you want to build something that's truly a category defining product in Europe that integrates in the way that we want to integrate into our customers, data sovereignty just becomes a no-brainer. Like, you need to do that to be able to scale. And I think for a lot of reasons, there's of course the political climate and everything else, but there's also a conscious choice of choosing European technology, because there's a perceived gap between capabilities of US technology and European technology. And in 99% of the cases, it's a perceived gap. We've been able to build everything on self-hosted models and on sovereign cloud infrastructure, which isn't Microsoft sovereign cloud or Amazon sovereign cloud, which isn't really sovereign in any way, but actual sovereign cloud infrastructure. And I would recommend, like, if you're building in Europe and you're aiming for any restricted, regulated, or even just in general B2B kind of angle, then you do yourself the favor of picking European sovereign products, because they're out there, and it is actually possible to build something truly meaningful and impactful based on that.
Yes. I think some companies might not entirely understand how important it is, but it's something that I completely agree with you on. As you know, I'm also quite involved with a company that focuses on data sovereignty as well. I have like 3 pillars when I talk about sovereignty and what that means in Europe. I think we need independence on 3 pillars, or at least work towards it, because they're not easy to solve. And one is energy, another one is defense, and the third one is data. Energy might be the hardest one to solve, and as we also see now with the conflict in Iran, defense, we're going to get there. And then data, that's also not impossible, but fairly hard if you look at the full layer, right? Because it goes from hardware down to the chip level, and then all the way up to the software layer. And really achieving true sovereignty means that we also have the chips being built here. And right now there's like a couple of foundries in the world that build all the world's chips. And, can you actually tamper with them? I've heard some stories about an AWS data center in China where the chips showed up with just a little bit of a dot on. I mean, this is not a confirmed story, but I think that this could probably, in a good conspiracy world, not be an impossible impossible theory that could happen. But you have to start somewhere.
Exactly, and I think that is perhaps the most important point, is that this isn't it's not fanatical in a way. Like, you need to start somewhere and then make deliberate choices, and just challenge the status quo, and the default being US tech providers, and then do that analysis and gap analysis. Say, what would it actually cost us to exchange these processes or these parts or that part. So I'm in no way. It's in no way an all or nothing kind of scenario. But there are a lot of great alternatives to existing, big tech offers out there, and often, more often than not, they're actually quite good.
Yeah, and the whole hyperscaler, like most of the data infrastructure.
Peter,
in Europe
I have a meeting now, Peter.
All right,
I have to go. Have that exactly.
Okay. Well, Michael, it was a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much, Michael, for having you, and I'm so sorry for all of the issues with with the technology today that kept it a bit short.
No worries. It was a great conversation, though. We'll pick it up later, Peter. Thank you.
All right, sounds good, Michael. Bye.
Bye.